All right, we got rugged. Uh, all right, I think we're good now. I'm hotspotting, so I'm not going to open the Zoom again. Sorry, team, but I will keep an eye on the chat. Um, cool. Yeah, I think that's good enough for people to start looking deeper into some of these other bonus questions. Um, I'll probably add something in the description about that, but we'll go through those next time. I think those ones you just need to know. Basically, the hard part about this is you have to figure out how do you find the Dune decoded contracts table. So I'll leave you to go and search for that, and if you can't find it, then you should tweet at them and tell them to make it easier to find. All right, let's do the hard stuff. Let's go through Aave v3 from scratch. I did already make sure that the contracts are decoded in here. At least some of them are. I don't know if these are the right ones or not, but this is gonna be kind of a rough way of seeing if things are decoded correctly or not. So let's see. Let's just start Aave v3. It is live, right? Hold on. Let me just make sure. 204. Oh, no, okay, that looks right. I was gonna say 204 rows does not look right. This is on Polygon, so let's go to Polygon scan. There's a V3 gateway. Cool. So let's just start taking notes on this. There's a deposit event here. Just making sure. This is Rapsmatic. Why is Rapsmatic giving a deposit event? Oh, that's why. It's the same as wrapped ether. Alright, transfer. Alright, the one thing I hate about Polygon Scan is that nothing is actually decoded. I don't know why. I'm sure they're like supported by Etherscan, so it should be decoded, but it's not. So we are gonna have to do this the hard way. There's a deposit ETH function. I want to find. This doesn't look right. Because I think this is just the ETH gateway. I don't think this is the actual Aave. Alright. Let's just go to the Aave Polygon. This is the Aave Polygon token. And I don't know if they're... Let's see, where's the pool? Okay. Let's just start saving some of this stuff. So I'm going to only choose one pair to look at, or one token to look at for now. So let's look at the A token for Matic, which follows a deposit into... gives you WMatic, which then gets deposited to give you a WMatic. Yeah. Alright. I think they just call it a ETH gateway generally, but there's no ETH involved here. It's just the native token, Matic. Cool. So normally when checking out DeFi protocols, I would say try and start with an earlier version first. Like the way I would think about DeFi evolving is very much like V1 was like kind of ugly tests for the most part of like, can we get this to work? And then V2 would be like the much more optimized version of V1 with like some sort of better fee governance gas structure. And then V3 and higher is usually when they're like, oh, what if we made this 10 times more complex to support a couple features? So V3, like if you're jumping into like Aave, for example, or Uniswap, and you tried to start with V3, you probably had a hell of a time trying to figure everything out. Right, so like definitely just start, like, if like Aave Uniswap specifically, definitely start from V2 first, because it's like the contracts are much, much simpler to understand, and the features are much, much straightforward, right? Like for Uniswap, everything is just in kind of one pool and shared liquidity. Well, not everything for a pair is just like tied together on one curve, like one swap curve versus V3. It's like you choose the ticks you want to swap or like deposit into, and just having that extra tick feature basically changed everything. And for Aave, my main context is like basically for V2 you can deposit and use anything as collateral, but it's all shared collateral basically. Versus in V3, I think they have some sort of difference in like types of assets, right? So you can imagine that if you had like safe versus unsafe assets, you could have much more flexible borrowing like risk structures based on what kind of collateral you're putting up, right? So that's my context on V3. And the first thing we're going to do, after just looking and doing to see like, okay, is it decoded, and like, does the deposit function still exist? Like, does the borrow function still exist? I see that there is still a borrow function. So I'm going to take that as well. Right. So hopefully deposit and borrow still work the same way, where you have some asset you have an on behalf of, which just means like, it's actually pretty important from like a composability perspective. Like if I deposit 100 USDC, obviously I'm gonna deposit that on behalf of myself. But if this is like another contract that's calling deposit into Aave, right? So if it's something like B protocol, which is built on top of like Aave, then they're gonna maybe want to deposit on behalf of me, right? So that I get the tokens. That's actually a bad example because B protocol still holds the tokens. But in a sense, it's just like this is good for composability, right? Or if you want to invest in Aave on behalf of your friends because they can't figure out the Aave interface, then you could go and deposit on behalf of them. They get the tokens, right? So it's a pretty important concept there. We won't go into referral codes, and that's about it. Yeah, asset amount. Cool. So the main context I think you need to know, if you want to skip V2 and just go directly into V3, how to use flashlight. We'll get into flashlights. That's more complicated. But yeah, sorry. The main context you have to know is the way all of DeFi works is you put in one token and you get a wrapped version of that token. All right, so if you were looking earlier at that like one deposit transaction hash, I was looking at they put in 100 Matic, and so they put in 100 Matic, which first got turned into wrapped Matic, which is basically wrapped Matic, wrapped Ether, wrapped whatever, is just saying, I want an ERC20 version of this native token, right? Because that just makes everything easier to manage when it's all the ERC20 standard. So they transferred in 100 Matic. It went through the gateway to become 100 wrapped Matic, and then it got deposited, and they, as in the signer, got 100 A wrapped tokens back, right? This is just called the A token. So we have that base thing in our mind, and what we should be thinking about is like, all right, how is this deposit being stored, like in like a contract? Like basically what contracts are holding the tokens? And by the tokens, I mean what contract is holding the actual Matic that was deposited, not the A Matic, because the A Matic is held by the user. Like, is it just, I think V2 is like, there's just like a lending pool contract, and then that holds your balance, and there's like a lending pool, like user struct, essentially, that stores like your statistics. And you can like either enable or disable things as collateral, and you can still withdraw even if it's collateralized, as long as like you don't go under your health factor, right? So that, I think, is the important context setting. And if any of that didn't make sense, either ask in chat or go and read it yourself. I think sometimes the white paper is not helpful, but in this case, I think Aave did a good job of explaining the main features through their white paper. So I'm going to start here. All right, March 2020. Capital efficiency, which this just reads to me as they want to improve, like, if you have risky and non-risky assets as collateral, then it doesn't make sense for you to be borrowing off of the risk weighting of just the risky assets, right? Like if you're borrowing off of ETH, then you should be able to have like a lower collateralization rate than if you're borrowing with like Uran's token, right? Honestly, I think that's the main thing for me. I'm not too sure what protocol safety and decentralization UX enhancements are in this case, but all right, generating more yield for liquidity providers, 28 billion in liquidity, which I think has dropped to 13 just because of the bear market now, but it was 20 billion when they posted this. Yield farming. Okay, so you have yield for. I'm just gonna explain basic stuff in case people haven't heard of this before, but you get yield when you deposit. All right, so if I deposit 100 ETH and people are borrowing my ETH, then obviously I get some of the interest that they pay for borrowing ETH, right? Yield farming is saying, okay, Aave wants to have more ETH or USDC in their lending pool than Compound does. So Aave is going to say, hey, on top of the 0.4% that you get like interest rate you get for depositing ETH, we're going to give you 0.2% in Aave tokens, right? So they're able to basically, quote unquote, bump the yield by using their native token. You can think of it as marketing or customer acquisition cost or whatnot for DeFi. And that is called yield farming, right? Here we go. Optimizing borrowing network or borrowing power. Any collateral can be used as a borrowable asset. Yeah, and because of that, risk parameters to borrow transactions have to be set to be quite conservative. And so the first thing you should do when you see anything about risk parameters in DeFi is you should try to find their risk parameters or their risk format. All right, so you can just search. Let's just do V2. And it actually comes up right away. And make sure that you're on the right version, because the risk parameters are going to be different per version. And you can see, hey, these are all of their assets, and what is, like, one, can you use that asset as collateral, right? So, like, USDC, DAI, FEI can all be collateraled, but, like, there's other stable tokens that you can deposit for yield, but, like, you can't use it to borrow off of, right? And this is something actually decided by governance, where they talk about, like, should we add an asset? Should it be collateralized? And if you can collateralize it, then, like, what is the liquidation threshold and, like, minimum, like, loan to value, basically, right? So, like, if the liquidation threshold is at 80%, then that just means, like, if DAI dropped from, like, let's say I had 10 DAI and I borrowed, like, 5 DAI worth of ETH or something, basically maximizing the collateralization ratio, or the LTV, then if the price of DAI, like, depegged and went down like 10% or 20% and hits the liquidation threshold, then I would have to give up my collateral, right? So I would be able to keep the 5 DAI in ETH, but then the 10 DAI that I have as collateral, basically a certain portion of it will be liquidated, just to keep the protocol afloat, right? And there's a liquidation bonus as well, and this just goes to liquidators. It's like a discount. Because you have to remember that, like, every action on chain has to be triggered by someone, so, like, someone has to pay the gas, right? So even if you're in default, you don't lose your tokens until someone liquidates you, right? So you're basically incentivizing the network to go and liquidate you to keep everything efficient, right? I'm not going to talk about reserve factor. But you can see everything here has, like, different levels of, like, liquidation thresholds and, like, loan to value. And loan to value is just, like, in our case, it was like we took 5 DAI out for 10 DAI, right? So our LTV is like 50%. And the higher just generally a way to understand it is the higher the loan to value, basically the more you can leverage up, right? And the higher the liquidation threshold means, like, that's how much room for error you have before you get liquidated, right? So just generally, you'll notice that liquidation threshold is always higher than LTV. That's just because, like, again, so simple math, like, if I borrowed 5 DAI and I have 5 DAI worth of ETH, right, and I had collateralized 10 DAI, then I'm at 50% LTV. And if the value of DAI went down to, like, 80 cents per dollar, then this would go down to 8, right? And so 5 divided by 8 is now, like, 62.5% LTV, right? And if it went down to, like, 60 cents on a dollar, right? So if DAI went down 40%, then I would cross the threshold and I'd be at 83% LTV, which is higher than the liquidation threshold, so someone could liquidate me, right? Hopefully that makes sense. That's just a general good frame of mind for, like, okay, this is how I can read this, and, like, oh, this one has an LTV of 49%, this must be like a fairly risky asset, right? So in this case, it's synthetics. Again, this is all discussed in their forums, so if you're ever interested in this, then you can go like risk parameters, Aave forums. And I'm sure you'll find a ton of proposals and discussions here about like how can we optimize these thresholds and LTVs to make it so basically everything is much more capital efficient, right? In this case, actually, I should know this. I don't remember what the reserve factor is. Allocate share of the protocol's interests. Oh, okay, that's basically like a protocol fee, I think. So my guess is this is how much interest accrues that would go to the DAO, essentially. Am I reading that right? Oh, sorry. Yeah, it goes. Sorry, it goes to the DAO. Technically, yes, but it's mainly to sustain in case there's like a high leverage situation or high liquidation situation, and like let's say, like for example, right? Let's say that you're completely dies, and like your LTV goes like through the roof, right? Not even like you go past 100%, right? So you're basically in default. It goes to like 120%. Um, then base technically Aave is underwater if that happens to too many assets, right? So they keep a certain reserve factor from the interest generated by those assets just to make sure that there's no solvency risk in the case that the peg breaks, right? So that's important. All right, enough about risk parameters. I'm going over that now just kind of as a review so that like when I try to look at this for V3, I can see if like something's changed, right? Right. So here they're just talking about most of it's on L1, which is really expensive. So they're only doing, I think they're doing this only on L2s. So you only see this on like Polygon and whatnot. In Aave protocol, the total collateral value is all collateral normalizing. Yep, yep, yep. That makes sense. Liquidity protocols. All right, this is going to be important. There's a concept called isolated pools and isolated pairs. My read on this is that there have been a bunch of other smaller startups that have tried to focus on specific pairs to make the liquidity of those pairs better. I think one of the main ones here would have been Rari, where you can basically spin up Aave forks for just certain token pairs, such that like it'll make more sense if I could showcase it. Where essentially all of these pools are their own sets of tokens, right? So they're basically their own Aave protocols, is each one of them. And so the way you can think about that is like, oh, if I choose what assets goes into this like combined collateralized pool, I'm essentially defining like the risk criteria of this pool, and it's isolated from the risks of other tokens, right? So like you could have tokens with like basically a bunch of riskier tokens that you wouldn't be able to see on Aave. You can create your own Rari pool for it. And like Aave can't add them just because that would like potentially mess up their whole like risk parameterization across, because they basically have one shared set of like liquidity, right? Where like all the deposits, all the borrows, all the collateralization happens in one place versus Rari kind of separates it. So I think that's what they're referring to when they're talking about improving collateralization through isolated pools or pairs, right? Like some of these are just going to be like this one is only 3 tokens. Wow, their interface is slow. All right. Point being, that is an example of liquidity segregation. So I'm guessing Aave wants to have some way of improving upon that further. I have guesses, but we'll get to it. Risk management. Okay. All right. So protocol safety. I think they're referring to this as. I think they're referring to this mostly as risk parameterization, and not. Yeah. Okay. I think they mainly mainly improve this liquidity risk, not smart contract risk here. And I guess that would just come with isolated pairs and pools. Not sure if those are different features. All right, decentralization, yada yada yada, multi-chain current. All right, here we go. Into the meat and bones. I hope people are still following. It's been, how long has it been? Oh Lord. All right. As you can see, this is pretty time-consuming stuff, but 25 minutes in, I feel like I have a good review of like, all right, if we're level setting, they're trying to improve on isolated pairs and pools, kind of taking from what they've learned from like risk parameter setting and like V2, and also taking from what they've seen in the ecosystem of like forks like Rari that allow you to make those isolated pools and pairs, but maybe don't really innovate on the risk side at a protocol level. And then they do this all in L2s. I think that's what I've gotten so far from like the summary section, right? So isolated liquidity pairs, isolated pairs. Right, okay. So here they're talking about if you have like isolated pairs, then you've essentially segregated liquidity, right? So like if we did like Uniswap style, like this is something a lot of DeFi faces, is like if you have a separate pool for like every single pair, then you would have to have enough liquidity on both sides for each pair to be usable, right? So if I have like USDC and ETH, and then also USDC and like Yearn, and then also USDC and like Uni, then I would have to make sure there's enough USDC in each pool, as well as enough of the other token for it to be usable as a market, right? Otherwise, hopefully you know about utilization rates, but the utilization rate would be really high if I was trying to borrow USDC and like put in Uni as collateral, but there wasn't enough USDC to borrow. Then the market wouldn't work, right? So that's liquidity segregation. And every protocol has like very different approaches to it, but that's definitely a big problem for borrowing deposits, even more so than like swapping, I would say. Because swapping, you just need a certain liquidity depth. Anyways, so segregation, you don't want borrowers. Yeah, you don't want borrowers to have to worry that much about like, oh, is there going to be enough liquidity in the pool to make sure that my like borrow rate isn't just spiking? Explaining this more clearly, like if you have 2 pools, right, you have one USDC ETH and then one USDC Uni, and you're borrowing the Uni pool, but then the yield is higher for USDC depositors and the other pool, the ETH pool, and people start moving their deposits from USDC from the uni pool to the ETH pool, it's going to become more expensive for you to borrow in the uni pool, right? And like you have no control over that, so you don't want to have that, right? And like this is an important point here. It's skewed towards riskier assets, because in general the yield would be higher if you're depositing like a token like Uni to borrow versus depositing ETH to borrow, right? All right. So they're saying that they're doing pools as a hybrid on top of pairs. Okay. I actually don't know what they're referencing here. Uniswap pool to borrow against. Oh, okay. It's the Uniswap pair. Got it. All right. So just summarizing that part. Liquidity segregation is a big issue. Liquidity tends to go to risky assets. If you always segregate liquidity, then the stable assets are going to have a bad time, basically. This is what I got from that section. Now we finally get to the overview. So, capital efficiency. So, main things, there's a portal, there's an E mode, and there's an isolation mode, and then there's new risk management structures. All right. So, portal. Oh, okay, this is transfer between networks. We're going to ignore portal. So, we have E mode. Extract the highest borrowing power out of their collateral. This can be categorized with each category having the following risk management parameters. A custom price oracle. Interesting. All right, so you basically have these risk parameters that are more customized by the pools you've created. So they can set 255 E-mode categories. Interesting. All right, so it's not that each pair or pool you create has its own E-mode. It's that generally there are 255 E-modes. My guess is the reason for that is that would help a lot with liquidity segregation. Because as long as you're in the same E-mode category, even if you're in different pools, you could probably leverage each other, right? Which that's pretty cool. Risk management. All right, here's an example. So category 1, stablecoins, 97% LTV, 98% liquidation threshold, 2% bonus. That all makes sense. User supplies DAI, which normally has 75% LTV, and that we saw over here, right? Well, it's 77% right now. So if they supply DAI, then they can borrow other stablecoins. Users capital set for 22% more efficient. That is true. It is 22% more efficient. So this is just comparing V2 to V3. This is a nice graphic they put in here. I'm not sure if E mode means that you can only. Yeah, it looks like you can only deposit and borrow from assets in the same E mode. So it doesn't look like I can deposit stablecoins and borrow Bitcoin at this rate. I don't know if I'm understanding that. Okay. One of the more relevant is governance. Let me be honest, I don't think I understand this isolated mode. So this is inspired by MakerDAO, so I would think that we would need to spend some time reading about MakerDAO. Um, hmm. All right, this is more just technical. All right, so I think that's the most we're gonna get out of the white paper for now. We have been going for a while, so I might pause this and continue next week. But essentially, I think next steps would be like, all right, it would be interesting to see. And I'll write this up, but we would want to find like what emotes have been defined already. We want to find what isolation modes have been defined, and like what can you borrow off of those, right? Because I'm very interested to see how like those assets tie across pools. And then I think from there we could start getting into like calculating which like what has the improved capital efficiency been and have people actually transfer their tokens. I'll write that up and put it in a tweet, but we can go over it next week. But yeah, appreciate you all for sticking around, and we'll kind of improve this as we go. Probably same format, just like practice questions for the first half, and then like protocol dives in the second half.